Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Cloud and Clear, Sada's podcast for companies entering Google Cloud. I'm your guest host today. My name is Patrick Monaghan. I'm the Chief Legal Officer and Corporate Secretary here at Sada, subbing in for Tony, our illustrious CEO and general host. Today's guest, I'm very honored to invite and have us join on a very timely topic. Sebastian is the Chief Information Security Officer at Nutanix, and he's also, we're proud to say, an independent director on Sada's board. Sebastian joined Sada's board about 3 months ago and serves on our Audit and Risk Committee. He is an accomplished expert and thought leader in the realm of information security, security management, enterprise risk management. And so we're going to talk a lot about those topics, particularly for companies who are navigating their journey onto the cloud or maybe already are on a public cloud provider like Google Cloud. So Sebastian, welcome to Cloud and Clear. It's great to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Excellent. Well, we're excited to have you here. So what I'd like to start with, Sebastian, is just asking you to tell our audience a little bit about your background, your career evolution to date, maybe some advice you might have for folks looking into careers in IT, and just tell us about how you got to your career position right now and everything that's gotten you to this point.
You know, I'll start with kind of how I got into cybersecurity. It was kind of a funny story. At a young age, I was really interested in reading about hackers and like hackers magazines. We used to have this magazine called 2600 magazine back in the day. I was an avid reader and just the whole topic of, kind of fooling machines and also the users of those machines into doing things that they're not supposed to do. Right. And so I found that kind of intriguing. And I was in a high school computer class, and the computer teacher challenged everyone in the class. He said, if anyone can break into a computer in this classroom, I'll give you an A in the class. And he said, by the way, it's impossible because I've just installed this full disk encryption software, and it has a BIOS password and everything. There's just no way that you're going to be able to get in because the whole disk is encrypted. And so I was like, okay, challenge accepted. And then I went home and I actually called the vendor. It was a Norton product. Norton got absorbed into Symantec over the years. But at the time, it was a Norton product. I called their tech support and I said, well, what if I've installed your software and encrypted my computer and forgot the password? And they said to me, well, if that happens, you're out of luck because the whole thing is encrypted and you need the password to decrypt. The only thing you can do now is wipe the drive, go into the master boot record, delete that, and just kind of format fdisk everything. And I thought to myself, well, if I can do that, erase the master boot record, I could probably write a little bit of code and just place it there without removing all that encrypted stuff that's there. And so I wrote a bit of code that just kind of pops up and says, Norton disk encryption error, please enter your password. And I put that, I kind of snuck into the computer lab the next day, and I put my little program on there that just pops up and says, disk encryption error, enter your password. And then, so during class, I called the teacher over and I said, hey, what's this? It's asking for your password. And he's like, oh, okay, let me see. And he puts in his password. And my program, of course, then saved his password for me to retrieve later. And then with that password, I could, of course, unlock all of the computers in the classroom and thus forcing him to give me an A. He wasn't too happy with it in the end. And he actually sent me to the principal's office and I got in big trouble and everything. But I said, hey, you challenged me and I did it. But I got the A in the end. But, that was kind of I would say one of my first experiences with, just the idea of hacking into systems, and oftentimes that's about fooling the people rather than fooling the software.
Not only am I glad to hear you got an A, but I think you taught your teacher and classmates a very valuable lesson about phishing and I mean, clearly he wasn't qualified to teach that class if he felt
right
that level of ruse. That's a very cool story. From high school on, were you always a programming guy? Did you study CS in college?
Yeah,
What the next step
yeah. Good
in your journey?
question. So the next step for me, even in high school, I was working in like a computer store. It was called Egghead Software back then. We sell software in actual boxes to people on CDs and diskettes. And I was also fixing computers in the store, kind of changing hard drives, upgrading hard drives, motherboards, etc. And I decided to take some certification training courses, and Microsoft certifications, Cisco certifications, just trying to get some credibility. As hard as like 17 or 18-year-old to be taken seriously for the jobs. And without much experience. So I did that. I learned a lot just about general networking and operating systems. And then sort of landed a first job doing sort of tech support kind of work. And then I taught Microsoft courses for a while, and I did a few little consulting gigs here and there, but mainly on the topics of Windows networking and stuff like that. But my first security gig landed when I was just looking at job listings, and I saw this security job that was really focused on Microsoft server platforms and Active Directory, which was something completely new at that point. And so I thought, that's something I know very deeply, and I'm really interested in security, and this kind of combines the two. So let me go after it, even though I've never had like a real security job. So in this sense, it was kind of like fake it till you make it. I was like, security, yeah, that's what I want to do. And because I knew the technology deeply, they gave me a shot, and it was a great experience. And I ended up, leading security for Microsoft platforms at the company at the time was called PeopleSoft, which became, Oracle after an acquisition.
So even in those days, how specialized was the security pipeline for somebody? Like, were many of the skills like getting Microsoft certification versus Cisco, were they easily transferable, or were there a lot of barriers to transitioning from one to the other?
No, it was very transferable. And I always tell people today who are interested in getting into security is an area where you really need to know how all the different components work and how they fit together. The security team needs to know the full stack, because that's what gets exploited. It's, the attackers are figuring out how to make things work in a way that they shouldn't work. And that takes knowledge, like detailed knowledge of how the system works. Once you know how the whole thing works from the network layer through the application layer, then you can start to think about how to exploit it and how to protect it from being exploited. So that, the folks on my team today are folks who, were deeply in networking for a while before they entered security, or deeply in operating systems and like IT management before getting into security.
Were these first roles, were you still a student at the time, or were you working? This is after you finished.
Yeah, good question. So I finished high school and I kind of jumped right into the workforce. And, I was like, I'm already working. I love this. I just want to go out and do computer work. And then, eventually, people, mentors and parents said, you really should go to college. And so I thought, okay, I better do that. I went to university, and at the same time I was teaching Microsoft courses at a local like Microsoft training center. And after 6 months of that or so, I said, I'm not really enjoying the college part of it. I'd rather just work full time, and I just kind of dropped that. And it took me 8 years to get back to finishing my university degree. I had a few jobs, and I was at IBM in their security and privacy consulting practice. And again, I had mentors and stuff telling me, hey, you should really finish that and maybe even get a master's, go for, if you want to be a leader, go for an MBA or something. So I said, yeah, I better I better do that. So at age, what was it, 26, I went back to university, finished that, and then eventually went for that MBA as well. So I kind of had a meandering path in and out of formal education in parallel to my career in cybersecurity.
How has I'll get into more detail with this later, but how has the overlay of those two, how has one helped the other? Because I think as you've progressed to more senior, like C-level roles, then having folks in the C-suite comfortable with you, you have to sort of check some of those boxes, right? But I think also having buy-in in building a security organization, like you said, if without a really detailed understanding of the full stack of the software and what's going on-prem and now with cloud and hybrid environments and all that, you can't be taken seriously, and you can't devise policy for an organization as big as like a Nutanix unless you understand it from top to bottom, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, and that's true. And I'd say I took an untraditional approach to my technical education. But a lot of people in IT and security do this too. And it's more like self-taught through tinkering. And, I started that probably when I was 14 years old and just, tinkered and broke stuff and figured out how to fix it. And so by the time I was ready for formal education, I thought to myself, well, I could take a whole bunch of computer classes and I'll know a lot of it. I'll probably learn some things, but I'm always thinking about like, what are my gaps and how to round myself out rather than just going deep in one area. So I thought, since I have pretty good understanding of computers and networks and a handful of certifications and all this, when I go to school, why don't I focus on business, right? And so I did my undergrad in economics. I did an MBA, and it was really about filling out the areas that I haven't self-taught. So rather than taking yet another computer course, just go ahead and round myself out. And I've done that in education and also tried to do that in my career, like change roles and see the industry from different sides. So I haven't been just an IT or cybersecurity practitioner throughout my whole career. I've also spent time as a consultant to CIOs and CISOs, and also running a consulting practice, so dealing with the P&L of that. And then also on the product side of things, and doing product marketing and launching security products to be sold to CISOs. So that's all in the name of kind of rounding myself out to see all angles of this industry.
How do you stay current? I mean, there's so much to learn, and it's constantly evolving, right? Security is an ever-changing space. So how do you keep up with your day job as a CISO at Nutanix, but also devote yourself to evolving as a practitioner if it doesn't naturally flow from your day-to-day job?
There's a lot of these days I get a lot of my news from like the people I follow on social media who kind of they're talking about the latest vulnerabilities and exploits, and then there's the official sort of vulnerability mailing lists and things that I subscribe to, cybersecurity lists. And of course, the great people who I'm lucky enough to have on my team who are always surfacing like really relevant news articles and white papers and stuff like that. But yeah, it is an industry where you really have to keep up with what's happening, especially those super time sensitive things. Like a new vulnerability is announced in a critical tool that you use. You have to be on that within hours. We actually a funny story on that I think kind of illustrates what we do in cybersecurity and the importance of that timeliness of patching. Just over a year ago, a vulnerability was announced in one of our critical tools that we use to manage endpoints. And basically all the news around it said, if you don't patch this thing right away, hackers across the internet, they're just going to scan for vulnerable servers and they're going to take them over. And so, we as security folks, we raise alarm bells, but we're usually not the ones who need to apply the patch. It's someone in IT typically, or some server owner. And so we raise that issue, And the response is like, okay, but we're in a change window, or in a change, outage window. We can't do any changes. We have to file a change request. Maybe we can get to it next week. And as a CISO, I have to say, no, this is an absolute emergency. I'm sure this thing will be hacked if we don't patch it. So we ended up patching it about half a day after the patch was released from the vendor, maybe, hours after it was released. And by the next day, there were companies all over the world being reported that they got hacked because they hadn't applied the patch yet. And it's just, that's so time critical in our industry, especially these days, because the hackers are increasingly automated, and all they have to do is kick off a script to scan across the internet looking for vulnerable servers, and then they just take them over.
That's incredible time pressure. I mean, from where I sit, like I know that we have very tight timelines around security incident reporting and breach notification, but the idea that you have, half a business day or less to patch your software or update your software across a large organization like Nutanix, I mean, that really requires a lot of coordination and speed of execution, which I think for a large organization must be really
it is challenging. And, sometimes we have to balance the risk and the reward. A lot of companies have, very revenue generating systems. You take it down for an hour, you lose, $500,000 or something. So there's a lot of juggling. But these days, you design systems to be resilient so that you can take servers offline without taking the whole service offline. And that's so critical, because that's what enables you to do that kind of rapid patching without a major service disruption. But when we don't have that kind of resilience, sometimes we have to make the really difficult decisions to just take something offline completely if we think it's that vulnerable. And for some reason, sometimes we hear about vulnerabilities before the patch is available, right? And so then you're really in a situation where you have to make some critical decisions. And sometimes the right decision is to just take that service offline until you can reduce the risk.
Do you think the customers and the end users that are supported by a security organization appreciate the trade-offs that you would have to make? So when you're in a position where like a patch isn't even available, a system or an application has to be disabled, right, until it's you've deemed it safe to reintroduce. Is that a trade-off that people are willing to make? Do you think organizations?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'd say it really varies. And one of the most critical jobs of a CISO, I think, is to explain and educate and start with the why. Here's why we need to do this. Here's the risk if we don't do it. And, over time, you can develop a reputation as a CISO. And some CISOs have a reputation of, just being very, black and white, like everything must be secure. I'm going to shut down everything that's not secure. And people get a bit annoyed about that because they're not sure if they're always balancing the risk and the reward or really thinking about the business objectives and goals. Or you can develop a reputation as a CISO who's always very balanced and explaining sort of the thought process and saying, here's why I think we have to do this. I thought about the risks and the rewards here, and unfortunately we have to make this tough decision. And it's appreciated when you explain, your thinking.
So what you just said, Sebastian, resonates a lot with me as a lawyer, because I also struggle with that. And I think a lot of lawyers do, because you don't want to be a Dr. No type, right? That's always in the way of the business. So I'm also struggling always to achieve that balance where I can be seen as an important business partner, so that when I do have to raise a yellow flag or even a red flag, people know that my heart is in the right place and that I'm trying to do something for the betterment of the business, our customers, other stakeholders in the organization. So having that credibility and protecting that credibility is super important, not only for me, but I imagine for somebody in your seat as well. But I want to talk a little bit about patching, because, I've read a little bit about obviously the SolarWinds breach, the Microsoft attacks that took place, right, that have been in the news in the last few months. And some of them, I think in the Microsoft case in particular, it was around a patch that was required for some. Can you talk a little bit? I know some of the folks in our audience are security experts like you, but can you briefly explain some lessons learned about those episodes? And I wanted to touch base with some of the things I've heard in terms of how organizations can learn from events like this that have been in the press recently.
Yeah, I think that it kind of takes us back to those lessons about patching. And there have been some vulnerabilities over the last year, including I think some of the Microsoft ones where it's announced before the patch is available. So you have to make some tough decisions then. Or if it's announced and the patch, they try to announce it and release the patch at the same time, ideally, because you don't want to tell the whole world, that there's a way to hack into this thing and then, release the patch a week later. But it happens sometimes, depending on how the vulnerability is disclosed and how it's discovered. And when it's in such a critical service, like, there were some Microsoft Exchange server vulnerabilities, or, we've had some, actually recently, some VPN vulnerabilities from some VPN vendors where they said, it's vulnerable and we don't have a patch yet. So that's a critical service, though. So you can't just turn off your VPN or turn off your email servers, right? So that's a tough one. And usually they'll offer a workaround or something. In the VPN case, there's definitely a workaround. You go in and make some modifications, and now it's no longer vulnerable. This is a constant juggling that we do. But the important thing is to really get all your teams into a patching cadence rather than just being completely reactive and emergency driven. You should at least know that we apply all the patches every month anyway. And occasionally we have to do one on an emergency basis. But if you're running things that are, 3, 6, 9 months plus out of date, you're really operating in the danger zone. And I think a lot of organizations have learned that, but some of them are still have operational challenges in really implementing that kind of patching cadence.
But let's talk a little bit about also ransomware. Like I've read that, with the Colonial Pipeline stuff and SolarWinds or whatever, that it's a best practice for security organizations to do regular ransomware attack simulations. Is that something that you do at Nutanix, or something that you would recommend?
Yeah, that the simulations are often focused on the incident response plan, which is absolutely critical, especially in a ransomware event. Why is it so much more critical in a ransomware event? Well, you're operating on a timeline typically where they say, we've got your files and you have 48 hours to pay us. So your incident response plan, including how you deal with ransomware, needs to be documented, and you need to practice it. Because if you're figuring it out as you go, it's going to take too long. And I've heard of companies that, that they finally decided they wanted to pay the ransom, but it was too late because it took them 3 days to get all the right people involved and check with outside legal counsel to see if it's legal to pay the ransom and all the steps that could have been done beforehand. That kind of practice is key. And ransomware these days, I don't know if everyone realizes, but the extortion kind of falls into two different categories. Now, there's the we have your data and we have the key, and now you can't get to it anymore, right? And if you have a backup, then you can save yourself. You can still get your data from the backup. And so if that's the only demand, then you can save yourself with backups. But increasingly, we're seeing more of a confidentiality demand. They kind of extort you by saying we're going to post it on this public website, and we have your customer data or what have you, unless you pay us. And that one, backup doesn't help you there, right? There are still things that you can protect yourself through, file encryption and stuff like that.
What special requirements would you impose, like on a vendor's software, as far as vulnerability testing, pen testing and stuff? Like what what is a recommended approach beyond sort of what the vendor might be willing to? Is that a back and forth with a vendor to say we have some additional testing requirements we want to impose on you as a customer?
Yeah, as a customer, there's a number of layers, right? There's sort of, most companies have a security questionnaire or something that they send to their vendors these days that asks them a lot of questions about how they manage their security. And they might also dive into product security and ask the vendor, how do you ensure there is no malicious code in your product? Or, how do you deal with product vulnerabilities? What's your SLA for producing a patch for a vulnerability in your product? Those are good things to ask. For cloud services who are actually holding your data, you want to know that the SLA for if they get some sort of breach that impacts your data, do they need to tell you that in 48 hours, 48 days? You want all that stuff in the contract, ideally. So yeah, I think it kind of starts with that questionnaire, and that's how you stipulate your the questionnaire translates into the requirements that you have. Some answers are acceptable and some answers are not. And you have to kind of figure out your risk tolerance and enforce it through that vendor risk management process.
You mentioned cloud, so let's talk about cloud, and particularly Google. I know Nutanix is a Google customer, and Sada, of course, is Google's largest resale partner. A lot of people, I think, have misconceptions about cloud and security, right? That the journey to the cloud itself is insecure, and that by placing applications on public cloud, you're creating certain vulnerabilities. How did you approach that at Nutanix specifically, and how would you advise a similarly situated CISO about making the journey?
I would say that whether you're working in your data center or in the cloud, you can either do things correctly or incorrectly, right? You can build it in a super secure way. You can build it in a not so secure way. In the cloud, the bottom layers of the stack, the hardware, the networking, physically, you're outsourcing that to the cloud provider to take care of all of that. But you're still responsible for the whole application layer, depending on what kind of cloud service you're, I'm talking more infrastructure as a service, like you would see. And so you're responsible for in some cases, the operating system. If you're just kind of spinning up a VM and you want to install an operating system and applications on top of that, and you're responsible for a lot of your networking settings. And, where companies go wrong is if they don't take full responsibility for all of that. The networking layer in the cloud, the operating system security layer. So if you just, ask, some application developers, go into the cloud and build your application there, you're probably missing some security layers because those application developers were not used to handling network security controls, because in the data center, that's done by someone else. Right. And so I've seen a lot of organizations where they just start building stuff in the cloud. It's so easy. It's so quick. The application just works. But it's exposed to, in a way that it shouldn't be, at the network layer because of some faulty configurations, because you didn't have anyone from the security team or the network security team involved in that project, because any developer can just spin up something in the cloud. So it's really about making sure that all your layers of security responsibility are taken care of. And I think increasingly organizations are realizing that, unfortunately, sometimes you learn the hard way, and it's important to get the word out there to just start out doing it the right way as you start building in the cloud.
Yeah, you touched on some great points there. I mean, the difference between being a cloud native developer, right, and developing things that are on premises and then migrating, the conversation between the public cloud provider or the company that's assisting with implementation, like Sada does, right, and understanding the scope of each party's responsibilities, because it's very easy to become complacent, rely heavily on the public cloud provider or a managed services provider, and neglecting some of your internal responsibilities, which can never go away. They can't be outsourced. They can't be forgotten because the responsibility still lies with the customer to sort that. Tell me about pivoting to a remote workforce. Obviously, a lot of companies are doing that. It appears to be, even post-COVID, something that's really here to stay. It's great for acquiring talent, right, and retaining talent to be able to let people work and collaborate and develop from anywhere. But it also creates, I imagine, a lot of headaches for a security-oriented organization. How are you managing that transition, and how would you advise others in a position to handle that?
Yeah, it can create headaches, but for an organization that was already very mobile enabled and remote, it hasn't been a tremendous shift for us. Everybody had the ability to either get on a VPN or get on a VDI to do their virtual desktop to do their work. But where I see the struggle, in talking to a lot of companies and seeing some unfortunate security incidents unfold actually related to remote work, I think one of the keys is really it's about multi-factor authentication. That's an absolute requirement for everyone. I think some companies that or organizations that weren't already in a work from home mode, they had to kind of slap something together really quickly. And, like we've seen with water treatment plants, scary stuff, right? We had one hacked in Florida, and then news came out recently that one was also hacked right here in California in the Bay Area. And it appears these were both through remote control software so people could work from home. But it was, just kind of simple remote desktop software with no multi-factor authentication. And I think one of the stories said a former employee's account was still enabled and that was used. So there's hygiene and there's, just the fundamentals for any external access into a company or into critical application, multi-factor authentication should be the bare minimum. User ID and password, that's a thing of the past. You can't protect anything with a user ID and password.
And it's so amazing because even just a couple of years ago, right, I feel like MFA was not widely practiced. And you're right. Some of the security incidents that we see in the market are around changes over just the last 24 to 36 months in terms of MFA becoming a minimum absolute standard versus a fairly new phenomenon. And then employees transitioning in and out of an organization, transitioning in and out of projects, making sure those doors are shut behind them is something that a lot of organizations, I think, are not as careful or thoughtful about as they probably need to be.
It's absolutely right. And, I think if listeners get one thing out of today's, session related to security, it's make sure you have MFA for accessing things from outside. And even if you do have it, make sure you have it everywhere. Because, so sometimes you just have to go out and ask the question, is anyone here aware of anything that you access without MFA? And you'll be surprised at the answer, I guarantee, even for companies that do have it. Because inevitably, there's some application that someone uses somewhere that may not be SSO integrated for whatever reason. And they'll raise their hand and say, oops, I do access this thing with just the user ID and password. And you have to jump on that because, it happens and it will lead to breaches.
Maybe my last question for today, and this has been fantastic, Sebastian, we'd love to have you again, but you're very much self-taught and a lot of folks in your space are kind of self-taught, and then you have the layers of continuing education. So what would somebody who has an interest in IT, wants to get into cybersecurity, what's the best path to pursue that?
I think a great path is to find some technology area that you're passionate about and really learn that deeply. So you don't just jump straight into security, but whether it's coding and writing code or whether it's being an IT practitioner or working at a help desk to learn how all the systems work and how they're fixed, get that technical grounding in something, and then the leap to security becomes a lot easier. But it's possible to start from scratch too. There's great security training available these days through various online outlets. Even you can find some good stuff on YouTube, even just for free, around different even Google Cloud certifications related to security. So yeah, get trained up, and a lot of people start out in like a security operations kind of function and learn and gain skills that way.
That's all great, and the level of information and education available to folks has never been greater. But
Yeah.
What you said resonated with me in terms of being full stack. So I think if you can combine a broader sort of agnostic IT background and then put the security layer on top of it, it helps you. I would think it helps you develop empathy and understanding for other stakeholders in the organization. So when you're designing policy for a big enterprise like that, you need that insight that can only come from sitting in their seat at some point earlier in your career, right? The fact that you
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, that's the best candidate is that well-rounded person who's sat on the other side of the table and had to implement or manage these systems that they're now responsible for securing.
That's great. And I know I told you that was the last question, but I have one more.
Okay.
If there's one more takeaway other than MFA, and I'm sure there are many more from this conversation, but if you were speaking to a sort of a lay person, a person who doesn't regard security as sort of their primary vocation and sees that sort of as somebody else's job, right? The CISO or the IT organization, how do you help every stakeholder in the organization understand the importance of security and what's the best way to give them at least a layman's understanding of what security responsibilities they have as a user in the organization?
Yeah. One of our key jobs in security is really educating and letting everybody know that it's a shared responsibility, and it's not something that us security folks can do for you, right? It takes everyone in the company doing the right things, following the right policies in order to avoid a security breach. And that takes continuous education. It also takes, we do things like phishing simulations because people are very vulnerable to phishing. And that's usually how, an attacker initially gets in is through some sort of an email vector. So, you can do simulations that constantly reinforce that message that you shouldn't be clicking on things that you're not expecting or that looks suspicious. So yeah, there's that constant training and reinforcement, and there's also the need for us as security practitioners and especially as CISOs to connect all the security initiatives back to the objectives of the business. We're not just doing security for security's sake, but we're actually in business to do something, and in order to do that thing, we rely on our customers rely on us to practice good security and to earn their trust by protecting their data and doing all the right things. So, I often tie it back to the customer and what they need from us.
That's super important. I love the mission enablement force multiplier message of security, right? It's not this thing up on a shelf that smart folks like Sebastian do and you don't have to worry about. It's something that can make your endeavor in our company and our company's mission travel further and faster. So having that buy-in is super key. Sebastian, this has been wonderful. So excited to have you on our board. So excited to see what you do next as a CISO, and I'm sure everybody has found this topic super important and relevant. So we'd love to have you back on the program again sometime soon.
Thanks a lot. It's been fun.
Take care. Thank you all for joining. We'll see you next time on Cloud and Clear.
Thank you for listening to Cloud and Clear. Check the show notes for links to this week's topics. And don't forget to connect with us on Twitter @CloudandClear and our website, sada.com. Be sure to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app.